The night shift nurse moved through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors like smoke, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible. Her name was Sarah Chen. Nobody asked. Nobody cared. They saw the hospital badge with her unflattering photo, the navy scrubs that hung loose on her 42-year-old frame, the sensible shoes that clicked softly on linoleum tile. What they didn't see were the hands. Her hands told a different story entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as she pushed a med cart down the third-floor hallway at 11:41 p.m., the skeleton crew of night shift nurses scattered across 23 patient rooms. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, that particular blend of hospital nights that never changed regardless of how many years you'd been breathing it. Sarah had been breathing it for 5 years now. 5 years of intentional anonymity. 5 years of being nobody important. Room 408 was next. The SEAL lay propped at a 30-degree angle, his left leg suspended in a post-operative brace following a motorcycle accident that should have killed him. Lieutenant James Webb, per the chart. 34 years old. No emergency contacts beyond his commanding officer at Naval Base Point Loma. Sarah had checked his room 3 times during the shift already, but protocols required vitals every 2 hours, and she followed protocols the way other people followed religion. Religiously. Without question. Without exception. She knocked twice before entering, the soft double-tap her signature approach, respect announced in advance. Webb's eyes tracked her immediately. He was the type of patient who stayed hyper-aware even on morphine, his body still operating on threat assessment protocols that 5 years of peacetime couldn't entirely recalibrate. Sarah recognized the signs. She'd worn the same operational awareness-like skin for 12 years before she'd buried it. His gaze landed on her face and stuck there, his expression shifting from blank hospital patient acknowledgement to something more deliberate. Searching. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Evening vitals, she said, keeping her voice level and professional. Soft enough not to startle him. Neutral enough not to invite conversation. She moved to the bedside with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this exact sequence 10,000 times, her hands already reaching for the blood pressure cuff coiled on the machine. "Have we met before?" Webb asked. His voice carried the rasp of someone who'd been extubated recently, his larynx still raw from the tube. Sarah's hands didn't hesitate. The cuff went around his right bicep with practiced precision. "I don't think so. Let me get your pressure." She inflated the cuff smoothly, watching the digital readout climb. 118/74. Solid. His heart rate on the monitor showed 72, steady as a metronome. She'd seen his chart. The attending surgeon had labeled him remarkably resilient, which in hospital speak meant someone with the kind of physical conditioning that came from years of specialized training. The kind of training Sarah herself had undergone in a previous lifetime. "No, I mean," Webb's eye stayed on her face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "There's something. Something about. Your oxygen is looking good too." Sarah was already removing the cuff, moving to check the foresight in his left forearm. The catheter was still clean, no signs of infiltration or infection. She made a notation on her tablet without looking at his face. The less eye contact, the less chance he'd see whatever he was searching for. The less chance the past 5 years of careful invisibility would unravel because some recovering Navy SEAL recognized something in the way she moved. "Pain level?" "On a scale of 1 to 10. 4, Webb said quietly, still watching her. "When did you start here?" Sarah reached for the portable vital signs monitor without answering immediately. She took his temperature, 98.1, normal. His oxygen saturation at 97%, perfect for a post-op patient. 5 years ago, she finally said, because some questions were simple enough to answer. "Room's looking clean. Call buttons in reach. Anything you need before I move to the next room?" He was still searching. She could feel it, that particular intensity of someone trying to place a face from a memory that wouldn't quite surface. Sarah had learned to recognize that specific kind of attention during her years as a senior chief petty officer. It was the look of someone whose instincts were screaming that they knew her, that something about her tactical efficiency and the way her hands moved, smooth, certain, economical, triggered recognition at a level deeper than conscious thought. "No," Webb said finally, the word dropping between them like a stone. "I'm good." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, her movement precise and economical. She did not limp. Her gait was steady and controlled, a careful compensation for the shrapnel that had embedded itself in her left femur 8 years ago and had never quite healed the way the army doctors said it should. In the mirror of the darkened window as she passed, she caught her own reflection, longer hair now than in her previous life, streaks of grey she'd decided not to fight, a face that looked every one of her 42 years plus 5 years of quiet. The old version of Sarah Chen, the one with a navy cross folded into a lockbox in her apartment, would have been unrecognizable to this current iteration. That version had carried 3 bleeding seals through Baghdad's Jolan district while the city burned. This version checked vital signs in civilian hospitals and flinched at loud noises in the break room and kept her combat boots hidden beneath sweaters in her locker. That version was buried so deep that even her own son, Marcus, 17 now, junior at Lincoln High, knew only that his mother had served as a nurse overseas. The full truth would stay buried. She'd made that decision years ago, and she'd made peace with it, mostly. The hallway opened onto the nurses' station, a modest arrangement of computer terminals and filing cabinets anchored by a single desk where the charge nurse sat reviewing staffing for the next shift. Sarah was halfway to the supply room when she heard the elevator chime. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Dr. Marcus Sterling stepped out of the elevator with the kind of entrance that made people look up from their work. Not because he was tall, though he was a solid 6'3", but because he moved as though every corridor in Oak Creek Memorial existed specifically to showcase his presence in it. His shoes were expensive, Italian leather that probably cost more than Sarah's entire week's paycheck, and they clicked against the linoleum with a rhythm that suggested someone who'd never met a tile floor he couldn't dominate. His coat was pristine white, his badge was polished to mirror finish, and his expression carried the particular intensity of someone who'd spent the last several hours consolidating power and had enjoyed every second of it. Dr. Sterling had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial precisely 6 days ago as the new chief of surgery, and in those 6 days he'd managed to establish himself as the kind of man who walked into rooms and made them smaller. His first week had included 3 resident corrections delivered loudly enough for nursing staff to hear, 2 requests for personnel files on mid-level surgical nurses, and an email to the entire surgical team clarifying that his decisions were final and not subject to committee review. He was the kind of surgeon who'd read somewhere that authority came from an absence of doubt, and he'd accepted that premise the way other people accepted gravity. Sarah was pulling sterile gauze from the supply cabinet when Sterling appeared beside her, his presence arriving several seconds before his body did, as though the air itself was recoiling from him. Nurse Chen. He'd learned her name from her badge, but the way he said it suggested he'd already decided who she was and why she fit into his organizational structure. Below him. Compliant. Replaceable. I was reviewing the incident report from room 412 earlier today. The resident indicated that you questioned his medication ordered during afternoon rounds. Sarah didn't turn from the supply cabinet. Her hand remained steady on the box of gauze. The resident ordered 10 milligrams of oxycodone for a patient whose chart showed a history of respiratory depression. I asked for clarification. You questioned his clinical judgment. I clarified an order. Sarah's voice remained level, measured, the way she'd trained herself to speak in the aftermath of combat when her natural inclination was to snap commands and expect instant compliance. The timid nurse voice. The one that apologized for seeing danger. The patient's vital capacity is compromised. That particular dosage would have created risk. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He was studying her the way a man studies a piece of furniture he's decided doesn't match the room's aesthetic. We have a hierarchical structure at Oak Creek Memorial, Nurse Chen. Residents are supervised by attendings, and attendings are supervised by surgical leadership. Your role is to execute care, not to serve as an additional layer of medical decision-making. That confusion about your position is concerning. Sarah removed the gauze and turned to face him. She didn't flinch at his proximity. She didn't flush or look away. Her hands remained steady at her sides. I have 600 hours of critical care certification beyond my RN, plus specialized trauma training. When I see a potential medication error, I have both the authority and the responsibility to flag it. That's not overstepping. That's patient safety. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Long enough for Sterling's jaw to tighten and his eyes to calculate something. In that moment, Sarah saw him categorizing her, no longer simply invisible but actively problematic. A nurse who thought too much. Who questioned too readily. Whose presence on his surgical team represented a structural insubordination he would need to address systematically. Your specialty training isn't listed in your personnel file, he said quietly. Dangerously. Where exactly did you receive this trauma certification? Sarah didn't blink. Overseas. At a clinic where I worked before I transferred to civilian nursing. The vagueness hung between them like smoke. Sterling's eyes tracked across her face, searching for the specific lie he was certain was there, but finding only the calm competence of someone who'd been trained to deliver information and nothing more. Who'd been trained to survive on information rationing. I'll need the documentation, he said. Official certification records. I assume you have them. I can provide what's available. What's available, Sterling repeated, as though the phrase itself was an insult. He was already turning away, already planning. Sarah could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his mind was clearly assembling a file, building a case. In 6 days he'd already learned the fundamental truth about institutional power, that the best way to eliminate someone who questioned you wasn't to confront them directly but to generate sufficient documentation to make their employment untenable. I expect those records in my office by end of business tomorrow. A nurse, Chen? Don't question my residence again. Not during rounds, not in writing, not informally. Is that clear? Understood, Sarah said. She watched him walk away, his expensive shoes clicking their rhythm back down the hallway toward the surgical suite, where he'd probably spend the next several hours reviewing files and making phone calls to people who owed him favors. Consolidating. Strategizing. Planning the methodical removal of a night shift nurse who'd had the audacity to question whether patient safety was more important than hierarchy. Sarah returned to the supply cabinet and removed the rest of the gauze she needed. Her hands didn't shake. She'd survived Baghdad. She'd survived IEDs and small arms fire and a 17-year-old kid with a homemade explosive device detonated 30 feet from her position. She could survive one surgeon's institutional vendetta. She'd learned long ago how to be invisible. How to absorb pressure without visible fracture. How to move through hostile environments without drawing fire. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that for exactly 3.7 seconds when Sterling had stood inches from her face demanding her documentation, her hands had wanted to move. They'd remembered a training that preceded nursing by more than a decade. They'd wanted to lock his arm and apply a compliance hold that would have left no visible marks but would have communicated something about who he was actually standing next to. The muscle memory was still there, buried but not gone, still twitching at the edges of her current life like a phantom limb. She pulled 3 more items from inventory and pushed the cart back toward the hallway, toward the patients who needed vitals checked and medications verified and someone to watch them through the dark hours when the hospital went quiet and the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song and the past tried to surface like something drowning. In room 408, the Navy SEAL was already staring at the ceiling again, his mind still turning over the particular quality of recognition he couldn't quite access. His eyes followed her as she moved past his doorway, certain of something he couldn't articulate, the way animal instinct knows danger before the brain catches up. Sarah didn't meet his gaze. She kept moving, invisible and necessary, the way she'd trained herself to be. The night was still young. Room 412 smelled like antiseptic and fear. The patient's family occupied every corner, 2 adult children hovering near the monitors, a spouse gripping the bed rail, elderly parents in visitor chairs that creaked under the weight of their worry. Dr. Sterling stood at the bedside like a general surveying conquered territory, his white coat pristine, his voice calibrated to fill the space. Sarah entered with the morning labs, her movements deliberate and quiet, the way she'd learned to move through hostile environments years ago. She set the chart on the counter and glanced at the post-operative pain management orders. 72 hours post-op, morphine every 3 hours around the clock, no renal adjustment despite a creatinine level that had climbed to 2.8 in the past 18 hours. She waited until Sterling finished explaining the surgical repair to the family, then spoke quietly, barely loud enough to interrupt the silence. "Dr. Sterling, the patient's renal function is declining. The morphine dosing might be too aggressive for current clearance." She kept her voice level, professional, the voice of someone offering data, not judgment. The room went still. The elderly mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. The adult daughter's eyes flicked from Sarah to Sterling, waiting to see how this would resolve. Sterling turned to face her fully. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse Chen, I didn't realize Oak Creek was now soliciting medical opinions from," he paused, letting the silence stretch like a blade being sharpened. "What did your application say exactly?" "An overseas clinic nurse." His voice dripped with condescension, each word pronounced with surgical precision. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to this family why you think your limited experience trumps my 15 years of surgical expertise." He gestured to the family with an open hand, inviting them to witness her incompetence, making her the problem in their eyes. Sarah felt her chest tighten, but her hands remained steady. The fluorescent light above hummed its mechanical song. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 120, then 118, then 116. She took one measured breath, let a single tear escape, and wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. The silence that followed was absolute. "A good nurse puts patients before pride, Dr. Sterling. I'm sorry you see that as a flaw." Her voice was quiet enough that only those closest to her heard every word. She turned to the patient. "Your labs are here. Try to rest. I'll check on you in an hour." She left the room before Sterling could respond, her movements unhurried, her posture perfect, leaving him standing at the bedside with his mouth tightening into a line. What Sterling didn't recognize in that moment was the composure of someone who had held wounded Marines in her arms while taking fire, someone for whom a verbal assault was nothing compared to the weight of life and death. He saw disrespect. He saw a nurse overstepping her credentials. He did not see that she was already filing away his words, cataloguing his weakness. He needed the appearance of authority more than actual competence. He would keep trying to break her. And she would not break. That knowledge made him dangerous. Thursday came, and the break room fell silent the moment Sarah pushed through the door. She was used to this now, the way conversations died mid-sentence when she entered, the way nurses suddenly remembered charting that absolutely could not wait. She pulled her lunch from the refrigerator, a container of leftover rice and fish, and sat at the small table near the window. Within 15 seconds, the room had emptied. 2 nurses hurried out discussing a patient census. Another remembered she needed to make a phone call. A fourth simply stood, placed her coffee cup in the sink with careful deliberation, and left without making eye contact. Sarah opened her lunch container. The fork trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself still. She set it down and folded her hands on the table instead, watching the parking lot 3 stories below where the Denver heat rippled off the asphalt. From the hallway, laughter drifted back. She heard her name, or rather the name they'd given her. Clinic Queen. The phrase floated through the doorway like smoke, delivered with the kind of cruelty that came from safety in numbers. The sandwich sat uneaten. Sarah closed her eyes and counted her breaths the way she'd learned to do in Baghdad, the way she'd learned to do so many things she'd promised herself she'd never need to do again. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, she'd stopped counting. The numbness was easier. Friday brought the formal documentation. The write-up appeared on the unit board where all staff reviewed their assignments during shift change, a crisp white paper laminated and posted with a plastic clip, positioned where every nurse passing through would see it. Sarah restocked the supply cart near the board, her hands working automatically while her eyes took in the words. Disciplinary notice. The date. Her full name. The citation, insubordination and failure to respect medical authority, with a list of specific incidents documented with Sterling's precision. Questioning physician orders without appropriate credentials. Charting delays of up to 47 minutes on medication administration. Creating a disruptive environment through persistent questioning of established protocols. 3 nurses read the notice while Sarah stood 5 feet away, counting gauze packages, her face carefully blank. She could feel their eyes on her, sympathy mixed with relief that it wasn't them. One of them, Jennifer from Knights, cleared her throat awkwardly and moved away. Sarah worked the supply cart with the kind of focus that made it clear she was not available for eye contact or conversation. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing remained steady. This was what she'd learned to do, absorb impact and keep moving. When Sterling walked past the board, he paused, not stopping, just slowing his pace to ensure the moment registered. He glanced at Sarah restocking supplies, his lips curving into something that resembled a smile. "Nurse Chen, I do hope you'll take this as a learning opportunity. We all need to respect the chain of command." He delivered the words with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was right, who believed that hierarchy was justice, who believed that any nurse who questioned him was, by definition, a problem. He didn't wait for a response. He simply continued down the hallway, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the sound of victory. Sarah finished the supply count. 83 4x4 gauze pads. 47 alcohol prep pads. 12 alcohol chlorhexidine combination wipes. The specific numbers anchored her to something real, something that made sense. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't judge. She pushed the cart to the next station and began again. In room 408, Lieutenant Marcus Webb watched her check his vital signs that evening, his eyes following her every movement with the frustrated confusion of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. He'd been recovering from a motorcycle accident, impact at 47 miles per hour, compound fracture of the left tibia, abrasions on his left arm down to the dermis layer. The morphine made time strange, made memory surface like debris rising through water. But something about the way she moved, the way her hands worked with absolute efficiency, the way she never wasted emotion, he knew her from somewhere. His left forearm bore a tattoo, still vibrant after 5 years, the ink darker than his sun-darkened skin, Sarah Chen. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Call sign Nightingale. The only name that had made sense to list when the hospital asked for emergency next of kin, because she was the closest thing to family he had left after Baghdad. But the woman checking his blood pressure had longer hair now, streaked with grey she hadn't had 5 years ago. Her face was older, carved differently by time and stress he couldn't quite name. And she wore navy scrubs instead of desert camouflage, her name badge proclaiming simply Sarah Chen RN instead of the rank that used to precede it. He traced the tattoo with his right hand while she finished documenting his vitals. "Have we met before?" His voice came out rough from the pain medication. "I mean, before the hospital." His eye searched her face for recognition. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. The investigation notice arrived Monday morning in a sealed envelope, thick paper stock, the kind hospitals used for official document delivery. Sarah found it in her locker at 6:38 a.m., before shift started, before anyone else was in the break room to witness her reading it. The letterhead was formal. The words were surgical. Pending external review of credential authenticity and scope of practice concerns, you are placed on probationary status effective immediately. Her name. Her credentials. Her career. All of it flagged, questioned, suspended. The envelope bore 3 signatures from board members she'd never met, their names typed in a row like a firing squad lineup. She read it twice. Then a third time, because understanding something was different from accepting it. The last line was the one that cut deepest: all clinical decisions must be approved by the attending physician before implementation. Any deviation from this protocol will result in immediate termination. Dr. Sterling had moved with surgical precision. Not crude. Not loud. Just thorough. He'd transformed her independence into a liability, her experience into a question mark, her judgment into something that needed permission. At 7:15 a.m., Sterling found her charting at the nurse's station. He carried a folder. He placed it on the desk in front of her, loud enough that the 3 nurses within earshot went very still. "This is your copy of the probationary directive," he said, his voice carrying the false concern of a doctor explaining why an amputation was necessary. "I know this must be difficult. But when someone's background raises questions, we have to be thorough. The board takes credential integrity very seriously." He smiled then, not a smile, really, more like a shark's mouth opening. Standard procedure when someone's overseas clinic experience is difficult to verify. Sarah didn't look up from her charting. She didn't reach for the folder. She simply nodded, a single small movement, and continued writing. The absence of response was like a door closing in his face. Sterling waited 3 seconds, expecting something: defensiveness, tears, panic, the collapse he'd engineered. Getting nothing, he turned and left, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm like impatience. What he didn't see was the tremor in her pen hand. Not visible. Not audible. Just the microscopic shift in pressure on the paper, the involuntary firing of muscle memory that had learned, over 18 months of careful invisibility, not to react when the world tried to bury you. Pain was information. Fear was data. Sarah had learned this in rooms with no windows and time measured in heartbeats. She filed the information away and kept charting. The probationary status changed everything. It turned her from a nurse into a suspect. It turned her experience into a liability. It gave Sterling the legal architecture to do what he'd been trying to do since she'd questioned his post-op protocol: remove her from any position where she might demonstrate competence. By 3 p.m., a memo circulated through the nursing staff. Effective immediately, nurses on probationary status will be assigned only to low-acuity patients and routine monitoring duties. All clinical interventions must be pre-approved by the attending physician. The words were neutral. The intent was clear. Sarah had been demoted without ever being officially demoted. At 2:27 a.m., during the quiet hours when the hospital seemed to breathe differently, Sarah was making rounds on her newly assigned patients: a post-appendectomy recovery, a mild pneumonia case, a diabetic foot ulcer follow-up. Nothing that required the kind of judgment that had kept her alive in Baghdad. Nothing that tested anything except her ability to document someone else's care plan. She was passing room 408 when she heard it, the subtle change in Lieutenant Webb's breathing pattern. She stopped. The doorway framed him like a painting, monitor lights casting blue shadows across his face, his chest rising with the shallow rhythm of someone whose lungs were filling with fluid they shouldn't be holding. His respiratory rate was elevated. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 91%. And there was something else, a barely perceptible asymmetry in his chest movement, the left side not expanding quite as fully as the right. Sarah's eyes moved across him in 2.3 seconds, cataloguing everything: the subtle tracheal deviation visible even in the darkness, the slight distension suggesting pressure building in the pleural cavity, the pattern of someone approaching respiratory decompensation. She didn't enter the room. She logged the observation and paged the night resident, a second-year intern named Dr. Patel who'd been at Oak Creek for 4 months and whose judgment Sarah didn't trust. He arrived 15 minutes later, stethoscope draped like a ceremonial necklace, his expression suggesting he'd been interrupted from something important. His post-trauma, Patel said, not bothering with a full exam. Some pulmonary edema is expected. Monitor and call if it deteriorates further. He left. Sarah stood in the hallway, every instinct screaming wrongness, and documented exactly what she'd observed: respiratory rate 28, oxygen sat 91%, asymmetrical chest expansion noted, subtle tracheal shift visible. At 3:22 a.m., the situation had worsened. Sarah was passing the room again when she saw Lieutenant Webb's hand gripping the bed rail, his body tense, his breathing more labored. She checked her watch. The shift change was at 7 a.m. The attending physician would arrive at 6. Something was accelerating. She paged Sterling directly: protocol for deteriorating conditions, the rules that governed how nurses reported dangerous situations to the doctors responsible for them, and waited. He arrived in surgical scrubs, still wearing them from an emergency appendectomy. He examined Webb for 90 seconds. Stethoscope to chest. Percussion. A cursory look at the monitor. Then he turned to face Sarah, who stood in the doorway, waiting for his clinical judgment. Given your current probationary status and documented tendency to overcall concerns, I'm reassigning Lieutenant Webb to another nurse, Sterling said. His voice was professional. His words were poison. You clearly can't maintain objectivity right now. I don't want you near him again. In fact, I'm restricting your patient assignments to low acuity cases only until this investigation concludes. He gestured to the charge nurse, who'd appeared in the hallway behind Sarah like a shadow. Give this patient to Martinez. Immediately. It wasn't a request. It was a command embedded in authority, wrapped in medical protocol, sealed with the probationary directive that made Sarah's argument career suicide. She stepped back from the doorway. She watched as Sarah Martinez, competent, newer, inexperienced with crisis, took over the room. She watched Sterling walk away, his presence making the air pressure change as he moved through the corridor. And she stood in the hallway, outside a room she could no longer enter, watching the Navy SEAL's oxygen saturation continue its slow decline. The clock was visible in every metric. Respiratory rate climbing. Oxygen sat dropping by small increments, 91, 90, 89. The subtle tracheal deviation had become more obvious. The asymmetry in chest expansion was now visible even to untrained eyes. From her vantage point 15 feet away, looking through the window glass, Sarah could read the crisis developing like a book written in physiology and vital signs. The pneumothorax wasn't simple. It was tension pneumothorax, pressure building, lung collapsing, the kind of thing that killed people in the 45 minutes before emergency surgery could be arranged. She needed to tell someone. The probationary order prevented her from entering that room or managing his care. But the order didn't prevent her from documenting, from calling, from escalating through proper channels. She paged Dr. Sterling again. She waited. The page went unreturned. At 4:15 a.m., Sarah was charting when Martinez emerged from room 408, her young face creased with uncertainty. His O2 is down to 87 now. He's breathing harder. Should I call someone? Sarah's hands moved without permission, her voice dropping an octave, every modulation of speech shifting into a register the probationary order didn't know how to suppress. Call Sterling. Tell him the patient is decompensating. Use the word hypoxia. Use the word immediate. Martinez nodded and disappeared, phone already in her hand. Sarah returned to her charting, her jaw clenched so tightly she could feel her molars pressing, her breath controlled in the way that soldiers learned when their hands wanted to shake but their training demanded stillness. She'd been buried before. She'd been buried in Baghdad when a building collapsed and she had to lie still for 4 hours while insurgents searched the rubble. She'd been buried in hospitals, in civilian clothes, in roles designed to keep her invisible. She could be buried in probation. She could survive a directive. She could survive. What she couldn't survive was watching a man die in a room 15 feet away while her hand stayed in her lap. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. That moment was still arriving, still moving toward her like a train whose whistle you could hear but whose headlights you couldn't yet see. The monitor alarm at 4:13 a.m. sounded like a scream that nobody else could hear. Sarah was 2 rooms down, restocking supplies in what Sterling had demoted her to, the low acuity ward, patients with stable vitals and uncomplicated recoveries. The kind of work they assigned to nurses who were being slowly erased. But her ears had been trained for 17 years to filter through noise, to catch the signal beneath the static. The alarm from 408 cut through everything. She was in the doorway in 3 seconds. Lieutenant Marcus Webb's chest was moving wrong. Only one side rising. His lips had gone the color of slate, that particular shade of blue that meant the body was making a choice, shut down the extremities, save the core, die slowly or die fast. His eyes were wild, the whites showing around the iris like a panicked animal's, and his hand clawed at the bedsheet with the desperation of a man whose lungs had stopped obeying him. The assigned nurse stood frozen at the monitor, finger hovering over the code button like she was asking permission from God. Sarah crossed the room in 4 strides. Her mind wasn't thinking in hospital protocols anymore. It was thinking in combat medicine, in the screaming dark of a Baghdad street where a SEAL's lung had collapsed under shrapnel and the only thing between him and death was her hands and a 14-gauge needle she'd grabbed from a trauma pack. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. Not a question. Not a request. "I'm decompressing now." She didn't wait for Sterling. Didn't wait for orders. Didn't wait for permission from a system that had spent the last week telling her she wasn't qualified to do anything. Her fingers found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy she could have drawn from memory at 3 a.m. with a gunshot wound bleeding out in her arms. The needle was already moving, the 14-gauge angiocath sharp and true, and when it penetrated the pleural cavity, the hiss of air escaping sounded like a tire losing pressure on a hot road. Webb gasped. Color returned to his face like someone had turned a dial up from 0. Oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor, 68, 72, 79, 84, 88, his chest expanding now on both sides, the machinery of his body remembering how to work. The code team arrived 30 seconds later, boots hammering tile, the organized chaos of a hospital in crisis mode. They found the patient breathing. They found Sarah calmly documenting the procedure, her handwriting as steady as a surveyor's line, her hands rock solid, no tremor, no hesitation. The kind of hands that had held lives together. Dr. Sterling arrived 6 minutes after that, still in his tailored jacket, still carrying that air of institutional authority like it was cologne. He moved to Webb's bedside, examined the patient, confirmed the lung had re-expanded, that the pressure was releasing, that the immediate threat had passed. His eyes were a different color now. Colder. More calculating. "Everyone out," he said. Not a request. The room emptied in seconds except for Sarah. Sterling's voice was soft when he spoke, and that was worse than anger. Soft voices broke people more efficiently than shouting ever could. "You just performed an invasive procedure outside your scope of practice, Nurse Chen. On a patient I explicitly reassigned away from you." He let that hang in the air like smoke. "Do you understand what you've done?" Sarah didn't answer. The old protocol, the one that had kept her invisible for 5 years, was to stay quiet. To absorb the blow without flinching. To take the hit and move on. But something in her chest had cracked open when that needle penetrated Webb's pleural cavity. Some sealed compartment where she'd been storing 17 years of training, 17 years of keeping people alive in circumstances that would have broken normal people into component parts. "I saved his life," she said. Her voice was level. Matter of fact. "That's what nurses do." Sterling's jaw tightened. That's what happens next. By 9 a.m., he'd made the calls. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she would find out, she was always going to find out, that Sterling had picked up the hospital phone with the methodical precision of someone executing a plan. For calls. For favors cashed in like coins from a deep pocket. First to Dr. Holloway, the cardiologist he'd cultivated from the board, she performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. "I need documentation." Then to the hospital attorney, James Branson, who owed Sterling a favor from a malpractice case 3 years ago. "Liability exposure is significant. She's practicing beyond her credentials." Then to Margaret Sims, the chief nursing officer who'd already bent twice for Sterling's manufactured investigations. The reassignment was explicit. "She directly violated my orders." And finally, the call that sealed it, to the overseas clinic where Sarah had listed her reference. "I'm calling about Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. She claims advanced medical training from your facility. Can you verify her credentials and training scope?" The voice on the other end went careful and quiet. Military hospitals didn't discuss assignments, training, or personnel status with civilian callers. Classified work didn't have verification letters. All the overseas clinic would say, All they could say was that their records were not available for civilian verification. That silence was all Sterling needed. By 10:33 a.m., security was at her locker. Not guards escorting a terminated employee, that would have been mercy. Just a single guard with a cardboard box and the expression of someone doing an unpleasant task because he'd been paid to do it. Sarah's badge was deactivated before she even left the building. Her access codes deleted. Her name removed from the schedule. By noon, Oak Creek Memorial's official statement had gone to HR. Serious concerns about credential misrepresentation and patient safety necessitate immediate separation. The parking lot was cold in the October air. The cardboard box held civilian clothes, family photos, and at the bottom, the pair of combat boots, worn leather creased from years of fieldwork, the soles still carrying traces of dust from a Baghdad street where she'd carried a man named Marcus Webb through burning air and incoming fire 5 years ago. She'd never cleaned them. Couldn't bring herself to erase that evidence that the person wearing them had actually existed. That evening, Denver's Veterans Cemetery was gray beneath rain that fell like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel at the headstones. Sarah knelt in the mud in front of the grave marker that read Marcus Chen, USMC, beloved husband, father, warrior. Her late husband had died 3 years ago, cancer, the slow kind that gave you time to say goodbye but not enough time to prepare for the absence. He'd understood what combat took from you. Understood that some people came home still half deployed, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still jerking awake at night expecting the sound of mortars. She knelt there in the rain without an umbrella, water dripping down her face, mixing with tears she couldn't quite control anymore. I thought I could do this, Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper. I thought I could just be normal. Just be a nurse. Just be a mom to James. I failed you. I failed everyone. The rain hammered harder, and she stayed there until her knees were soaked and her hands were numb with cold. The boot sat in the cardboard box in her car 50 yards away, still carrying Baghdad dust that she'd never had the heart to clean. Dust from a night when she was someone else entirely, someone with a rank and a purpose and a unit that needed her to be strong. That version had saved Marcus Webb's life on an August night in 2019, moving through streets that were burning with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. That version had disappeared 5 years ago when she'd signed the medical discharge papers and promised herself she'd never be that person again. But at 4:56 a.m., with a man's lungs collapsing and 30 seconds left before cardiac arrest, that version had surfaced. And now the entire hospital knew her name. Now Dr. Sterling had started making calls. Now everything she'd tried to bury was about to be exhumed, whether she was ready for it or not. The rain kept falling. Sarah kept kneeling. And somewhere in an apartment across Denver, her 17-year-old son was about to find a wooden case hidden in the attic, the one she'd forbidden him to open, the one that held every medal, every commendation, every piece of evidence that his mother had been something other than just a nurse who worked night shifts and cooked dinner on Sundays and tried very hard not to remember what it felt like to have blood on your hands. Sarah was packing her Denver apartment in numb silence when the front door opened without a knock. Her 17-year-old son, James, stood in the doorway with his face flushed red and jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working. He wasn't crying. Worse, he was furious in that measured, purposeful way that reminded her of his father. In his hands, he carried something wooden. Something she'd hidden in the attic 7 years ago and explicitly forbidden him ever to open. James, don't. Mom, we're past that. His voice didn't shake. That's what terrified her. They need to see these. You can't let him win. The wooden case was mahogany, lined with velvet the color of old blood. Inside, arranged like artifacts in a museum, lay the evidence of a life she'd spent 5 years trying to bury. Ribbon bars. Medals catching the apartment's afternoon light like accusations. A Navy Cross in its original presentation box. Certificate after certificate, each one a ghost she'd promised herself she'd never have to explain. Her hands didn't move to close the lid. That was the moment she understood her son had already decided for her. The hospital's emergency board meeting convened at 7 a.m. the following morning in the conference room on the 3rd floor. 23 people around a mahogany table. Sterling sat at the head, his posture the careful arrangement of a man who still believed the room belonged to him. The hospital attorney sat to his left, her expression already skeptical. Dr. Holloway, the chief of medicine who'd signed Sarah's termination without reading the details, sat with her hands folded like a penitent. Security stood near the door. James Chen entered with his mother's case in his hands and his voice ready to crack but refusing to break. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy. 7 words. The room went dead silent. Not the comfortable silence of agreement. The suffocating silence of ground shifting beneath them. James's hands trembled as he opened the case, but his voice remained steady. Everything you need to know is in here. The nurse that Sterling had personally appointed to his review committee, a woman named Margaret Sims who'd been systematically reporting Sarah's problematic independence to administration, stood with shaking hands and opened the military file. Her face went pale as she read. Not the normal pale of surprise. The ashen pale of comprehending that she'd been weaponized against a decorated veteran. She read the first line aloud, her voice barely audible, service record, 12 years. 3 deployments. 3 theater combat medals. Bronze Star. Her hands turned the page. Silver Star. Another page turned. She read the next one and the next one, each one its own small devastation. 2 silver stars total. For Bronze Stars. 3 Purple Hearts, 1 for a gunshot wound to the left shoulder that had never fully healed, 1 for shrapnel across her ribs, 1 for the concussive blast that had stolen hearing from her right ear. The room held its breath. Then Margaret Sims read the final citation, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Carried 3 wounded SEALs through enemy fire in Baghdad. Coordinates Bravo 739er, Jolin District. November 2019. The door to the conference room opened. Lieutenant Webb rolled in his wheelchair with one hand, his military uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, his eyes fixed on Sarah with the intensity of a man who'd just solved a puzzle that had haunted him for 5 years. Recognition crashed through his face like a physical thing. Senior Chief Chen. His voice came out thick, rough with the weight of 5 years of wondering. It was you. In Baghdad. You carried us through the kill zone after the IED hit. You kept my arm from bleeding out. You? He stopped. Composed himself the way operators do. Listed the medals like they were evidence in a court of law, 2 silver stars. For Bronze Stars. 3 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross. Each phrase its own sentence. Each medal its own standing ovation that nobody in the room was brave enough to deliver. She saved my life twice. Once in Baghdad. Once here, 4 days ago, when she performed a needle decompression that your investigation tried to make her a criminal for. An FBI liaison stood slowly from the corner of the room where she'd been present for an entirely unrelated healthcare fraud case. Her expression had transformed from bureaucratic boredom to something that looked like genuine awe. Senior Chief Chen's missions in the Baghdad area remain partially classified by the Department of Defense, she said quietly. But I can tell you that she walked away from a distinguished career that would have made her a flag officer by now. She walked away to heal from PTSD in anonymous peace. She chose to work nights in a hospital where nobody would ask questions. She chose to help people who would never know what she'd already sacrificed to keep them safe. Sterling's face had transformed into something slack and disconnected, like he was watching his future dissolve in real time. The attorney beside him stood without a word and walked out. She didn't excuse herself. She simply left, the door closing with a sound like finality. That's when the same security guard who'd escorted Sarah out with her cardboard box 3 days earlier re-entered the room. He placed a cardboard box on the table directly in front of Dr. Sterling. His voice was flat, professional, but his eyes were something else entirely, the eyes of a man who'd served in the military himself and understood exactly what he was witnessing. Dr. Sterling, I believe you know the way out. Sterling left. Nobody watched him go. Nobody needed to. The investigation that followed moved with the precision of a surgical strike. By Wednesday afternoon, the hospital attorney had reviewed every write-up Sterling had filed, each one now recontextualized as systematic harassment of a Navy Cross recipient with documented service-connected PTSD. Dr. Holloway provided testimony about Sterling's explicit campaign to correct hierarchy problems, which was corporate language for eliminate anyone who threatened his authority. James Chen and Margaret Sims became cooperating witnesses, detailing the coordinated pressure campaign that had targeted Sarah methodically. By Friday, Sterling's medical license was under state board review. The investigation uncovered a pattern that made the hospital's legal team go silent. 3 previous hospitals, for nurses driven out, always the same targeting methodology, always the same result. The Denver Post ran the headline on Saturday, Oak Creek surgeon terminated after targeting decorated veteran. Sterling's attorney negotiated his immediate resignation in exchange for limiting public details. But the details couldn't stay limited. His privileges at 2 other Denver hospitals were suspended pending investigation. The state medical board hearing in March was brief and decisive, his license revoked for falsifying an investigation, harassment, and patient endangerment. Insurance companies cancelled his malpractice coverage like he'd become radioactive. The surgical practice that had offered him partnership rescinded it in writing. The network he'd spent 15 years cultivating, board connections, mentored residents, political allies, evaporated within 72 hours. None of his calls were returned. 6 months later, Sarah was restocking supplies at Oak Creek Memorial when her son texted her a photograph. Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table in a Denver strip mall, a cheap banner advertising affordable coverage hanging behind him like a tombstone. He was selling insurance policies. The image had captured him mid-conversation with an elderly woman who looked deeply unimpressed. Sarah stared at the photo for exactly 7 seconds, then deleted it without responding. Some victories taste like nothing at all. They taste like the absence of something that used to hurt. The night shift in late summer felt different. Sarah moved through the corridors with the same precision she always had, but the invisible weight she'd carried had transformed into something else, not gone, but recognized. The nursing staff greeted her by name now. Not with exile. With respect that carried something close to awe. The hospital had issued a formal apology. Back pay. A commendation in her personnel file. But the real gift came on a Thursday in August when Lieutenant Webb arrived at her locker with a small wooden box and a voice steady as granite. "You don't get to be invisible anymore, Senior Chief. Not after saving my life twice." Inside the box was a shadow box containing a photograph of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen in dress blues, her decorations visible, her eyes younger and harder. Her son had helped arrange it. Webb placed it on the shelf in the nurses' station where everyone could see it, a quiet presence that transformed how people saw the woman who checked their vitals and held their hands through the dark hours. Sarah didn't talk about Baghdad. Didn't explain the Navy Cross. Didn't rehearse the story of carrying 3 SEALs through kill zones while her shoulder bled and her ears rang. But she didn't hide anymore either. When a new resident questioned her suggestion about a deteriorating patient's fluid status in October, Sarah met his eyes with a voice that carried the weight of 5 years of medical training and 12 years of combat medicine combined. "Doctor, I've performed field medicine in conditions you can't imagine. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm trying to save your patient." He listened. The patient lived. On Veterans Day, Sarah stood at her late husband's grave in sunshine, her son beside her, both of them quiet in that way families are when they understand they've survived something together. "I think I'm learning, Marcus," she whispered. "To be both things. The warrior I was and the nurse I became." The boots remained in her locker, retired now beneath folded sweaters, their Baghdad dust finally at rest. Sarah would walk the night shift corridors with her stride marked by that faint limp, her hand steady during every procedure, her presence somehow transformed from invisible to indispensable. A young nurse approached her one shift asking how to stand up to a dismissive attending. Sarah considered the question, then smiled slightly as a good nurse puts patience before pride. But a good nurse also knows her worth. If you found this story of hidden strength resonating with you, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let me know, I read every single comment. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.